what I'm going to do today is, there is a bit focus on human trafficking, but kind of one of my bugbears, I have to make it straight from the outset, is a conflation of human trafficking with slavery, and lots of people are now using the term interchangeably, which really gets me, because sort of the latest ILO figures show that slavery is now estimated to affect nearly 21 million people, 20.9 million people. Of that, they haven't sort of disaggregated the trafficking figures from that, but prior to that was 2.45 million people who were affected by trafficking out of 12.3 million people. And so, yeah, I speak to people, and professionals as well, who are constantly sort of conflating the terms slavery and trafficking. So all trafficking is slavery, but not all slavery is trafficking. So I'm going to kind of come at it from that angle and kind of give a bit of a wider context as to the work that we do. That includes trafficking, but also a wider movement to do with slavery as well. So, Anti-Slavery International, founded in 1839, so just a year after the Emancipation Acts came through in British Parliament, which made slavery illegal in the British colonies except for India and a couple of other colonies, but for mainly the Caribbean colonies, slavery was then abolished. The 1807 Act abolished the slave trade. The 1833 Emancipation Act, which is then enacted in 1838, which abolished slavery, also stipulated that the slave owners would be paid compensation to the tune of £20 million for the loss of their property. So negotiating this bill, that was a really integral part to get this bill through to end slavery. And the UCL have done a really interesting study looking at where that compensation money went to, so the industries that came out of the compensation money, and some of the existing companies, law firms, banks, etc. today that were founded or benefited from that money that was given as compensation. So it's a really interesting thing to look at. Nick Draper at UCL has led that study. But before the founding of the organisation, there were over sort of 1,000 anti-slavery societies made up of ordinary men and women who were calling for the abolition of slave trade and slavery. And there's, I think, probably my greatest hero is Thomas Clarkson as opposed to William Wilberforce, because William Wilberforce came into the anti-slavery abolition debate through being persuaded not just by Thomas Clarkson but by William Pitt as well, the Prime Minister at the time, who told Wilberforce, who wanted to really look at the issue of vice and things around prostitution and gambling, the abolition of that. He told William Wilberforce that slavery was probably a much more useful thing to advance his political career. Whereas Thomas Clarkson was a student at Cambridge University who completed his thesis on slavery, and he worked tirelessly, and I'm slightly out of breath running from taxi to get here, but he was on horseback up and down the country raising awareness about slavery, getting people to know what's happening on the slave ships, not just in regards to what happened to the enslaved Africans, but to the young men, young British men who were being press-ganged into ships setting sail for Africa. So he's one who really started the movement, and then got people like Granville Sharp, lawyers, involved in the whole anti-slavery movement. And so, in terms of how we continue to work today, we still follow a lot of that tradition, and so Clarkson would carry out research and expose slavery, and we still do the same. So we tend to sort of err on the side of caution with figures. So there are academics like Kevin Bales who quote 27 million people in slavery, which we don't. We use the ILO figure, which was previously 12.3 million, but in the last year they've recalculated and carried on the studies and actually estimated it a much higher figure of 20.9 million people. And so we carry out research with local organisations. We also support local organisations on the ground to release and rehabilitate people from slavery. So we have partners in over 20 different countries. We don't work in any countries in terms of service delivery where we don't have partner organisations. For example, we do work in Uzbekistan around advocacy, but we can't deliver projects in there, one, because of the way that the government is structured and what happens to human rights defenders in Uzbekistan. So we don't deliver any service delivery projects, but we do advocacy at the UN and at the, sorry, at the ILO around that. And I suppose that's where our unique selling point is we have a history of working towards legislation being put in place to end slavery. And obviously campaigning for the eradication of slavery. So we're not talking about historical slavery, which most people know of in terms of the transatlantic slave trade and the capture and transportation and enslavement of Africans on plantations, though that's where our history starts. Like you said, most people might think about sexual slavery today, or trafficking into sexual slavery, but not many people would think of a child domestic worker in the Philippines or in Togo, in Tanzania, or even in the UK as a form of slavery today. Not all child domestic workers, and certainly not all domestic workers, are in slavery. There are those that have their working rights respected, there are employers who give them contracts, who respect their rights to having time off, there are employers who don't withhold their passports, there are employers who allow them to go out. But for many of the children and many domestic workers in the world today, in terms of being forced to work and having restrictions placed on their freedom of movement, which then puts them into a slavery situation, that's a really common occurrence, and it's estimated that there are at least 15 million child domestic workers in the world today. I haven't updated my 20.3 million figure, but it does stand at the moment at 20.9 million people in forms of slavery across the world. And when we're talking about slavery, there does need to be an element of force there. So it's not, people talk about sweatshop factories, for example, and say that's a modern form of slavery. Not necessarily. People working in sweatshop factories can be in slavery if they're being forced to perform that work. Is that what is going on there? You can have really horrendous labour exploitation in sweatshops, and certainly there are in terms of people being paid such a minuscule amount for working upwards of 12, 13, 14 hours a day. And unfortunately, the global economic system works in such a way that it facilitates that to happen. But if that person can leave at the end of that day and choose to return to work the following day, they're not in forced labour or in slavery. If a person is owned or controlled by an employer, then that's a characteristic of slavery, and that control can be meted out through physical or mental abuse or threatened abuse. If a person is dehumanised, if they're treated as a commodity, as a good that can be bought, sold or exchanged, as tends to happen in human trafficking, then that's another characteristic. Another characteristic as well is having physical constraints placed on a person's freedom of movement, not just in terms of having them in a room locked up, but having your passports removed, having your identification documents removed so you're not able to move freely. So those characteristics have to be present for it to be slavery. So lots and lots and lots and lots of laws that make slavery legal. Brazil was the last country to abolish its participation in slave trade in 1888. Since then, when the League of Nations was formed, in 1926 we had a slavery convention which defined slavery mainly in relation to ownership. Now, I think increasingly for academics that definition is becoming more difficult because obviously you can't have legal ownership anymore, and so supplementary conventions have been devised to really look at the concepts of forced labour that's not dependent on ownership. That's not to say that slavery with ownership doesn't take place today, it does. As especially in the issue of descent-based slavery in countries like Niger and Mauritania, where people are literally born and owned by their slave masters. But the concept of ownership is one that's been sort of debated within academic circles. I might test you in the UN allegedly in other end, guys, or maybe I would. So yeah, there are lots of laws at the UN and the ILO that prohibit slavery. So these are some of the breakdowns in terms of figures. Asia being the largest, the place where slavery occurs mostly, and I think there's more people there essentially, and there's more systems of vulnerability there in terms of things around the caste system, for example, and vulnerability to poverty. But as you can see, most of the world is affected by slavery today. That's just a map that depicts that. These are some of the forms of slavery that we work on today: bonded labour, trafficking, child labour, which isn't always child slavery, but child slavery would fall under child labour, and I'll talk about the distinction between those two terms later on. Descent-based slavery, early enforced marriage, and forced labour. Bonded labour, which tends to take place in a very particular form in South Asian countries. So we work in Nepal, India and Pakistan, where people literally are bonded into working for someone else because they've had to borrow money to pay for something as basic as medication for a sick child. And so if a person is borrowing money in order to pay back that debt, they have to give up their labour and they lose control of their labour. And so they end up working in many different industries, including in factories, including in agriculture, including working in the brick making industry. What's particularly sad about bonded labour in South Asian countries is it's linked to the caste system, and that 90% of people in bonded labour belong to the lowest caste group who are discriminated against. So if you hear of Dalits or untouchables, they are most likely to be the people in bonded labour. So these are just some images of where bonded labour can occur, and for me one of the sort of saddest occurrences of bonded labour, or vulnerabilities of bonded labour, is that of manual scavengers. So these are people who are born into a particular caste group, a particular caste within the Dalit caste, where all the job that they're described to do at birth is to clean sewage. And so the discrimination that they face because of their untouchability is so grave, and not just the discrimination but the impact on their health and life chances as well. If you imagine that you're immersing yourself essentially in feces for the whole day, every day, and think about the health consequences of that. Bonded labour is also very much linked to land access, or lack of access to land. So the image there of the family at the bottom was taken in Nepal, where I think it was the first time I really kind of got to grips with how bonded labour happens in relation to land. So the man there at the bottom, Taru, explains that his great-great-grandmother had a piece of land, and the government of Nepal introduced land taxes which they couldn't pay as they were essentially subsistence farmers. Higher caste people said, we'll pay the land tax for you, sign your land away to us. They did, and essentially ended up being serfs of the land. So they were working the land for the new landowner, and they were being paid bags of rice. So if they needed anything monetary, they had to borrow money from the landowner, and in borrowing money which they could never pay off because they never made any money, the debt kept accruing and accruing until 3-4 generations later they were still paying off that debt. But what's really encouraging, you get to hear lots of horrible things today, but what's really encouraging is that the government of Nepal is actually one of the better governments for addressing the issue of slavery. And so it has repatriated land for the Dalit communities, and so it's believed that slavery is more or less coming to an end in terms of bonded labour for the Dalit communities. There are other indigenous groups that are still subjected to bonded labour, but because obviously it's a long process, and because of the changes that the government is implementing, it's going a long way to show that slavery is something that can be tackled if there's a political will to do so by various governments. Trafficking. So, my really colourful action, means, purposes definition of trafficking. Of which protocol does that come from? Yeah, brilliant. So that's a Palermo Protocol, which defines trafficking as being linked to recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring, or receipt of persons or a person through the means of threat, use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, vulnerability, and for the purpose of exploitation. I think that's the main important bit in terms of the end result. So, and that's what distinguishes trafficking from smuggling as well. And so a person can be moved, recruited, transported when they're being smuggled, but they generally comply to that, as do many trafficked victims who comply to the movement and the transportation and where they end up. What they don't comply to, and what will then make it slavery, is the end result of the exploitation. So when they get to a situation, that job that they've been promised doesn't exist, or exists in a much different way to how they imagined it was going to exist, and they can't leave that situation, that's when it becomes trafficking and hence slavery. And then, the anti-trafficking debate has been kind of taken up by the anti-prostitution lobby as well, who argue that if we got rid of prostitution, we'd get rid of trafficking. But as you rightly identified, what does that mean for the people who aren't trafficked into sexual exploitation? And also the fact that many people don't want to admit, but some women know they're moving to another country to work in prostitution. It's a choice that they've made to go and earn money through working as sex workers. What they wouldn't consent to is the fact that they're being forced to do that work in conditions they hadn't consented to. So in terms of the payments that they're receiving, in terms of not being able to leave the brothel, in terms of the abuse that they will face. And so you can consent to being moved across a country illegally and or legally for the purpose as well of working as a sex worker, but not consent to the forced element of it and the exploitation element of it when it then becomes slavery. And also, really importantly, trafficking doesn't need to be crossing the borders illegally. And again, that's something that's becoming conflated and something that's becoming co-opted a lot by the anti-immigration lobby, who say that, well, if we really care about human rights, we need to tighten our borders so that people aren't trafficked into somewhere like the UK. Tightening our borders isn't really going to protect people from being trafficked, because in the UK today, there are many people who are here legally. So you have your Eastern European workers who are entitled to be in this country, but because they've been told that the UK employment system works in a particular way, which necessitates their passports being taken away from them, which necessitates their wage slips not being given to them, which says that they have to stay in a particular place and not leave that place, and they've been deceived and then speak the language. Many of them may not speak English when they come to work in somewhere like Kent or Lincoln or Cambridge, working in agriculture. So they've been forced to do that work even though they have a legal entitlement to be in the country as citizens of the EU. Other people from places like China, Vietnam, Nigeria, girls and women who are trafficked into sexual exploitation, who are trafficked into domestic work, who are trafficked into the hospitality and catering industry, and children from Vietnam who are trafficked into cannabis picking. Some of them, though a large percentage of them, may be here on irregular migration, using irregular migration methods, but some of them may have come here on a visitor's visa or a holiday visa or a working visa. What traffickers will do is then retain people's documentations. So if you've got a visitor's visa for 2 or 3 months, if your passport is retained, then you become illegal if you've overstayed the provisions of your visa, and so they can actually use that to hold people in forced labour situations. And also there's been the news stories in the last few months about the young girls who've been trafficked across the UK into sexual exploitation, so it's not always involving people from somewhere else, and it's not always illegally crossing the border. So 2007, I estimated at least 2.5 million people being trafficked into forced labour, including sexual exploitation. Again, the figures in terms of the country breakdowns are similar to that for slavery overall. Lots of causes of trafficking. There are lots of reasons why people want, when it's related to migration, why people want to migrate to other countries to work. And what makes it especially difficult is that the systems in place allow traffickers to really exploit people who are looking for a better life, for more money, to send their families, children to school, or to get an education themselves. But what's really interesting, the whole debate about Romanians and Bulgarians coming into the UK, and some figures showing how Polish migrants have left the UK once jobs started drying up. So once the construction industry, for example, started, jobs then started drying up, lots of Polish migrants went back to Poland. Shows you that people aren't going to want to migrate to a country where jobs aren't available. And so that's one thing we really need to address. So these very low-level jobs in terms of agriculture, in terms of food processing, all of those things, migrants will want to go to a country essentially where they can get jobs. The right-wing media will focus on the handful of people who come and get benefits and have X number of children, etc. But that's a real minority, because in order to qualify for those benefits and to make any sufficient amount of money from benefits, it's not the easiest thing to do. So many people want to get jobs, and I think that's something we need to address as a nation in terms of why people want to migrate to this country. But also what's really interesting is what would you say, which country, what would you say was the biggest form of aid to developing countries? Aid.
Africa.
Hmm?
Africa.
Okay, so no, not AIDS, not HIV AIDS, but which country would, what's that?
The US.
The US, okay. Any other guesses? The Scandinavian and the Nordic countries are actually one of the high providers of aid to developing countries, but the highest provision of aid to developing countries are diaspora communities. So it's people who have migrated from those home communities and working in other countries who send money back home. I forget the figures, but it's something like 3 times as much as all the aid that's given by all the international governments, plus all the foreign direct investment that's put in those countries. 3 times as much as that amount is sent back home at diaspora communities. So when you're seeing things like Red Nose Day and all the money that's being raised for developing countries, it's actually the diaspora communities who are providing most of that money. And so there's an argument there that if it was made easier for people to work and send what's called remittances back home to their families, in terms of development of developing countries, if that was really done in a structured way, if those remittances were being put to good use in terms of building infrastructure, in terms of building schools and hospitals, etc., and if the pathway for migration was made easier for those people, then the amount would be even greater than it currently is at the moment. So there's some issues there. So we've got lots of anti-trafficking legislation in the UK, but when was slavery actually abolished in the UK?
2000.
Okay, brilliant. I think you're like the first group to ever get that. So the Coroners and Justice Act of 2009, which came in 2010, there was an amendment in section 71, which now includes forced labour. So even though we had anti-trafficking legislation through the Sexual Offences Act and the Immigration and Asylum Claimants Act, slavery that wasn't linked to trafficking there's no way that could be prosecuted if a person was found to be holding another person in slavery, whether or servitude or forced labour, until that act came through. And so, excuse me, a lot of the latent buzzard cases and a lot of the anti-slavery in terms of homeless men being co-opted into forced labour, that's being prosecuted under Section 71 of the Coroners and Justice Act. Again, with probably stuff that you've found in terms of people thinking most people trafficked into the UK from Eastern Europe and women into sexual exploitation. Most of the survivors are from African countries, China and Vietnam, and increasingly there are more men who are being trafficked into forced labour situations. So the Poppy project used to be the government-funded project looking after women who have been trafficked, mainly into sexual exploitation and domestic servitude. But the Salvation Army has now got the grant to do that work. And what they found in 2012 was that 2/5 of UK trafficking victims are men, and that 43% are for forced labour. So in terms of forced labour catching up with sexual exploitation for trafficking, that's what's happening there. So there isn't much in the way of conviction for traffickers. The sentencing under the two acts, in terms of Sexual Offences Act and the Asylum and Immigration Claimants Act, is for 14 years, but traffickers are getting an average of 4.69 years, and in many cases they're not being trafficked, they're not being prosecuted using anti-trafficking laws, so they could be prosecuted using things around rape laws, and that's a big issue there. So we signed up to the European Convention on Trafficking in Human Beings in 2008, and it came into force in 2009, and that's supposed to provide minimum protection for people who've been trafficked, including a reflection period of 30 days for trafficked people, residency permits, non-discrimination clauses and compensation provisions. We're not doing terribly well on that as a country. So in terms of giving credit where the credit's due to the UK government, the government went beyond the 30-day reflection period and proposed 45 days, even though good practice advises 90 days, but I suppose they've gone beyond the minimum. We also had a reservation on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which meant that children from foreign countries were not entitled to the same rights as children born here. So that reservation has now been withdrawn, and it said that children can no longer be deported without access to specialist help. It is however still happening despite the withdrawal of the reservations. So when you have young boys who are being trafficked from Vietnam and forced to work in cannabis plantations, when the police carry out raids to bust these cannabis plantations, the boys are imprisoned and in many cases deported for having committed a criminal offence, despite the fact that we're supposed to protect them as victims of trafficking. Around the compensation issue, that's hardly ever happening. It's mainly falls to pro bono lawyers to take on that work, and with things like legal aid becoming increasingly more scarce, many lawyers just don't have the time in which to take on compensation proceedings. It's supposed to form part of the mainstream criminal proceedings, but it's not. We haven't done that as a country yet. And in terms of residency permits, the Convention recommends that you have 6 months through the criminal justice route. So if a traffic victim goes through and is able to testify against a trafficker, they should be given a 6-month residency permit. Or the social justice route, which is where a person might be way too petrified and too sort of psychologically damaged to testify in court. We're supposed to also give them a 6-month residency permit. But the UK grants 1 year for the criminal justice route and has a discretionary leave policy for the social justice route, i.e. if you don't testify in court, you're hardly likely to get it. So, so in terms of a successful anti-trafficking campaign, there's an EU directive that came in through the EU in 2011, which the government refused to sign up to for a while, but because of lots of pressure sometimes works, doesn't always work, as you'll get to see in a moment, but lots of pressure. I think we had about 47,000 signatures of people calling for the government to sign up to the directive. They eventually rescinded and we're now part of that directive, and they've also amended, we've got the Protection of Freedoms Act in 2012, which then modifies some of the anti-trafficking legislation to reflect the directive. In terms of where we are in setbacks, there's an anti-trafficking monitoring group, which includes organisations like Amnesty International and Expat UK and Enslavement International. And what we're doing is monitoring to see how the government is implementing provisions of the Council of Europe Convention. And what we've found is from looking at the UK Human Trafficking Centre records between April to December 2009, looking at 527 potential victims of trafficking referred through what's called the National Referral Mechanism, which is a system where you sort of a trafficked person will go through various systems to be identified and determined whether or not they've been trafficked. So there are 89 people from Nigeria within that system, 70 from China, 46 from Vietnam, 37 from the UK, and at the time 74% were women or girls. In terms of the identification, 76% of the UK people were identified as being trafficked. 29.2% of EU citizens were identified as being trafficked, whereas only 11.99% of non-EU citizens were identified as being trafficked. And what obviously you can see from there is that the majority of people who are potential victims of trafficking are from non-EU countries, yet they make up the least percentage of people who are correctly identified as being trafficked. Why do you think that might be?
Because they themselves wouldn't call it trafficking.
Okay. It's a little bit more cynical.
And they put them into another category, so you shouldn't be here in the first place.
Essentially because, so it's always a bit of a trick question, because when the National Referral Mechanism sits is within the UK Borders Agency, so So the UK Borders Agency is tasked with identifying people as being trafficked and putting them into the correct protection and rehabilitation schemes. Obviously the UK Borders Agency has an overarching objective, which is to tighten our borders and make sure that people who aren't supposed to be here aren't here. And the thinking is that, well, people are just going to say they've been trafficked in order to stay in the country. If you think that's the Bradford cases at the moment, the young girls who were being groomed by men into sexual exploitation, and the fact that these girls weren't believed by many social workers, by the police, very UK-born girls, because people have a particular perspective of them. You know, they've come from bad homes, etc. You know, they're the type of girls who might wear short skirts and hang out on the streets. So, you know, they're probably just making it up anyway, the fact that they're being forced into sexual exploitation. And these are UK citizens that we have that attitude towards. So what hope is there for people from non-UK, from non-EU countries specifically? And so that's where we're at the moment, and with lots of other setbacks as well. I've mentioned the Vietnamese kids being put into prison and deported. So we're not at a very good state in terms of trafficking, and I might talk about, so I'll just skip my slides and talk about Home Alone campaign. So that was a campaign we had between 2010 to 2011 to have a new international convention which will protect domestic workers, including the 15 million mainly girls across the world who are vulnerable to slavery. This is from the UK, so domestic work happens in other countries, happens in the UK. There are migrant domestic workers who are registered with an organisation called Calian between April 2006 and March 2007. So in the UK, where people who have domestic workers are likely to be more educated and more affluent than the average person. So this is what the domestic workers reported. A quarter of them had been physically abused, been beaten, slapped, having things thrown at them, been spat at, having their hair pulled. 9% of them reported sexual abuse. 69% of them reported psychological abuse, including threats to have them deported or thrown out of the home. 2/3 of them were not allowed out of the house without their employer's permission, and 1/3 of them had their passports taken away and kept by employers. So these are UK employers that are doing this. I've met domestic workers who have spoken about working for celebrities, actresses, models who do these sorts of things. We had a recording from the Irish Migrants Help Centre of a woman who recorded herself asking her employers when she was going to be paid. And they basically said to her, if you don't stop asking us that, we'll make sure that you get taken out of the country in handcuffs, kicking and screaming. And that's always struck with me because, you know, people tend to think that we live in a really democratic, civilised society that has respect for people's human rights, and that these sorts of things are happening elsewhere. But the fact that it's happening, you know, in the UK and in Ireland just really, I don't know why it upsets me more in a way that, you know, people who ought to know better, you know, and the fact that we have a system that's not supposed to be discriminatory against workers because they come from a different place, and that's happening here. So anyway, we're campaigning for this ILO convention, and it's been successful. It's been ratified by Uruguay, Philippines, and another country, so it's actually coming to force. But there are 8 countries which refrained from voting in favour, which abstained from voting for the convention. Can you think of which countries they might be?
Saudi Arabia.
voted in favour, despite how appallingly migrant domestic workers are treated there. Thailand, I think, was one of them that abstained from voting. Probably voted in favour. US voted in favour. Voted in favour.
Korea?
What's that?
Korea?
Voted in favour. Yeah, South Korea, that would be.
Yeah.
I don't think North Korea took part in the processes. So I can't think of all 8 of them, but I know the Czech Republic abstained from voting, Panama, El Salvador, Sudan, can't think of the other 3, but the UK was one of the countries that abstained from voting in favour because it argues that we've got sufficient protections in place for domestic workers. Obviously, factors like this hadn't been considered. And also, what's happened now is that the Theresa May a few months ago took back what was essentially protection for migrant domestic workers. So the Labour government had a rule whereby migrant domestic workers had a year-long visa in which they could change employers if they were being abused or exploited within that year without having to leave the country. So they could try to find new employment, and organisations like Calian would help migrant domestic workers to find new employers. But Theresa May has now made it a 6-month visa, within which time you can't change employers. So if you're being abused or exploited, you have 2 choices: stay in that situation or face being deported. And so that's the situation that we have at the moment. And in terms of making it a lot easier for people to be exploited, I think that's essentially all that that U-turn has done. So I think we've done trafficking, it's 4 o'clock. I can leave now or talk about other forms of slavery as well. You guys have time for about 20 minutes more?
Yeah.
Yeah?
I have to go, but I'm probably the only one, so
Okay. Okay, cool. Thank you for coming.
do you have your question? I had a couple of questions,
Okay,
but
cool.
I'm not sure how. You know, in terms of the UK legislation, what are they planning to do now? That because it was in the week, sorry, it was in the news last week that it wasn't really living up to the expectations, and I think that sort of emphasizes on the gap in law and enforcement. So any ideas of what's to come out of that?
We haven't, as far as I know, have any meetings with any sort of governments or civil servants yet to kind of know what they do to address it, or if they even want to. I think the UK government with sort of threats of leaving certain bits of the EU, for example, which would relate to the EU directive and the convention. I don't know, I think kind of given the political climate at the moment, and given the rise of parties like UKIP and the government have this reaction to well, the public want us out of Europe anyway, and they think our powers are being eroded. So, and given what we've seen around the migrant domestic workers visa as well, and the lack of sufficient implementation, I'm not sure how much they're going to sort of take it seriously, in the sense, they can just have a general attitude of, well, it's lots more things coming from Europe that we don't need to be focusing on. So, I don't know, I don't want to sort of berate the government too much, but from what I've seen so far, it's not really hopeful. And when it came in, yes, it signed up to the directive, but since then we've just seen more and more erosion of rights of people who have been trafficked and who are in similar situations. So keep checking the website, so if there are any updates from the government, they will be posted on the website.
Thank you.
Okay.
Just one more. You know, the Swedish law for prostitution, I know it's not exactly trafficking, but there's been a lot of talk about it. Do you think it's an effective way of dealing with prostitution and trafficking?
In terms of prosecuting the men who go to, I don't know. Again, that's sort of another one I have to slightly sit on the fence on, because I know in some cases, for example, when women have been trafficked, it would be the customer or the man who finds out they've been trafficked and reports it to the police, for example, and so there's been sort of elements of protection there for women. So if you're going to be prosecuted for visiting a sex worker, you're not likely, you hear something like that, you're not likely to report it. So I'm not sure in terms of protecting trafficked people how relevant having that in the UK would be. So that's a position that I hold, and I think the organisation holds as well.
That's interesting, because I think from what I've read, it sort of seems to say it's the sort of better way, but
I think it's another perspective that you wouldn't sort of necessarily hear again when from sort of the active prostitution sort of brigade or the anti-prostitution lobby. And also, I know, not speaking on behalf of sex workers or anything, but there are sex worker unions who get really annoyed, for example, that it's seen that everyone in prostitution has been trafficked, or everyone in prostitution is a victim, when they argue that some women freely choose to go into sex work and so need rights and protection whilst working as sex workers, and to sort of have this real criminalisation of customers or clients who are not being abusive and who are sort of respecting the rights of a sex worker, for example, is going to be detrimental to sex workers. But again, not speaking on behalf of a sex worker union or anything. So yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Okay. So other forms of slavery that we work on are what would be termed unconditional worst forms of child labour. So there are 218 million children who are in child labour, which means that they're working children, and 126 million working in harmful or exploitative conditions. But the ILO Convention 182 defines what's called the unconditional worst forms of child labour, which estimates that there are 8.4 million children in slavery, and that's children in forced and bonded labour, in prostitution and pornography, kids who have been forced to fight in wars as child soldiers, kids involved in other what's called illicit activities such as drug smuggling or begging. And it's estimated that of the 8.4 million children, at least 1.2 million have been trafficked into any of those situations. So these are some of the forms of forced child labour across the world that we work on. So spoken about domestic work, kids who are being trafficked from places like Pakistan and Sudan to racist camel jockeys in the United Arab Emirates. Really interestingly, the government, the UAE government, says that's been abolished, and they actually paid the sum of money to have the kids repatriated back to their homes. So they worked with UNICEF to have the kids repatriated back. And I thought, really interesting. That was it. But my partner works. He's a lecturer, but he also works with an organisation that looks at migrant workers in the Middle East. And they've just recently completed a film which was done in Bangladesh, looking at the kids who were who'd been repatriated back. And in terms of new information I found out is, I knew that the kids were being kept deliberately malnourished whilst they were working as camel jockeys in order to keep their weight down. What interviews with the former child camel jockeys showed those that they were being given pills to deliberately keep their weight down, as opposed to just being not being fed, and that they're subjected to sexual abuse as well. But really, really interestingly, a couple of lawyers in America wanted to work with these children to sue some of the Emiratis who owned these camels, but some of the people who owned these camels were in government and within the royal family. And so when this case was being drawn up in the US, they've unearthed letters. I'm not sure if it's going to be distributed, and it's going to be premiered in London in a couple of weeks, so if you ever get a chance to watch it, it's called The Soundtrack. But it shows documents from the Emiratis to George Bush at the time, basically saying you need to make sure that these lawyers stop these investigations. We've got a really good relationship with the UAE and the United States, and we don't want anything to happen to this relationship. So basically back up from these investigations, which I think is really interesting, and also puts UNICEF in a bad light when in all their documentation they're sort of thanking the UAE government for the provision of these funds, but if they're also being implicated in owning these camels that these kids are being forced to race, it's slightly dubious there. We work on issues of forced child begging across the world, but our main project at the moment is in Senegal, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. The cotton picking, the reason why I was late today. So kids being taken out of school in Uzbekistan by the government, who forces the teachers to take the kids out of school to go and pick cotton. If the children aren't picking enough of their quota of cotton, they're threatened with expulsion or with bad grades, and they have no choice but to pick the cotton. The cotton is mainly bought by companies based in the EU. Uzbekistan receives what's called preferential import duties of its cotton into the EU, and so one of the actions that we wanted was in 2011. There's negotiations for the extension of the trade deal with Uzbekistan and the EU, and it's just completely ridiculous that the EU should be essentially subsidising forced labour and forced child labour. And so our campaign was to call for the removal of the preferential import duties, but that hasn't been successful so far. The preferential import duties are still in place, but the trade deal that would have extended, negotiations that would have extended the trade deal were halted, and that's a group of young people from the school in Eastbourne who went over to Brussels to the European Parliament to speak to the members of the European Parliament and persuade them to reject the extension of the trade deal, which they did. So forced child, there's forced child harvesting in cocoa in countries like the Ivory Coast, and children being forced to grow cannabis in the UK. Kids in Senegal are being subjected to forced begging, so their parents will send them to these schools for a number of different reasons. One, access to education is difficult to come by in rural villages in Senegal, so even though many African countries, in accordance with the Millennium Development Goals, now provide free primary education, actually accessing education is still really difficult and problematic for many families. And also the parents want the kids to have a Quranic education, so they'll send them to the cities to go to these schools called Daras. The kids are mainly 5 to 15-year-old boys who go to these schools. The parents are mainly poor and so make no contribution to the upkeep of the schools at all. So there's no contribution to the schools, and the kids are being made to learn the Quran by rote. But then the Marabous, the teachers, also say that in order to feed the children, they need to go out and beg. And what's really sad about it is that many Marabous, not all of them, but most of them, are making far more than what's needed to actually look after these children. So in a country where where average wages are really small, some Marabous are making upwards of $60,000 US a year by forcing these kids to go out and beg. And there's a really a good film that's been made called The Least Favoured Children of Senegal that looks at the issue of forced child begging and just the horrendous treatment that these kids are subjected to. So if they come back and they haven't made enough money, they're beaten by the teachers, they're not fed, and they're made to sleep in these really horrendous conditions. And Human Rights Watch estimates that there are at least 50,000 boys who are being subjected to this in Senegal. That's one of the problems that we're working on, and we're working with the government of Senegal to try to regulate these schools so that forced begging isn't taking place. And there are several daras that are now modern daras where forced begging isn't taking place, and the kids are having more of a wider education than just the Quran, so they're learning French and things like maths as well. And again, which shows that it can be done, but there just needs to be a commitment and a political will to do so. Slavery in the supply chain, I'm sure you know, most people think again of things like sweatshop labour and things, but as in the case of Uzbekistan and forced child cotton picking, we shouldn't just be thinking about the factory conditions that people are working in to make products that are exported, but where's the raw material coming from? So cotton in the case of Uzbekistan, in conflict areas like the Democratic Republic of Congo, things like coltan, which are being used to make our mobile phones and laptops and computers, but there's hardly any talk about it in the media, despite the fact that nearly 5 million people have died since 1998 in the conflict in the Congo. No one really mentions it. It goes on every day. The number of women who are raped as a tool of war in the DRC, and yet we still continue to get our mobile phones and our laptops and things. And I asked a lecturer at Bristol who was looking at the history of the DRC, and I thought, well, why hasn't there been, sort of huge public uproar in the case of, say, blood diamonds from Sierra Leone, for example? And his thinking was quite a cynical one, that diamonds are a luxury item, and so people will make a bit of a fuss over it, but coltan is such an essential item to our everyday life, but hardly any of us know about it. It's so fundamental to the operations of these electronic goods, and so hardly if anyone knows about it, but even if we did know, would we kick up that much of a fuss over the fact that children are being forced to buy coltan in conflict situations, given that it's not a luxury item? There's a products of slavery map which shows you some of the goods that are produced using forced labour. For me it's interesting because it is our map, but it was sponsored by the US State Department, and so of course good countries aren't on there, so the UK isn't on there, and the US isn't on there, despite the fact that there is forced labour in our agriculture and our food processing industries. Let's talk about descent-based slaveries. I spoke about it earlier on in terms of people being owned when they're born in countries like Niger, Mali, and Mauritania. Hadijatu Mani, the lady sandwiched between Hillary Clinton and Michelle Obama, when she was receiving her International Women of Courage Award in 2009, which she received for the fact that she's the first woman to have ever she's the first person to have ever taken a government to court for its failure to protect citizens from slavery, which we helped her to do. So she was born into a slave caste in Niger, where she was sold for about £250 to a 64-year-old man when she was 12. And when she was 13, this 64-year-old man took her as his 5th wife. So under Islam, men can legally take 4 wives within the Quran. But in Niger, they have their 4 legally recognised wives, even though most Muslims across the world don't practice this. As in Niger, particular community do, so they'll have their 4 legal wives, but then they also have 5th wives, whereby these women are essentially domestic, people in domestic slavery and in sexual slavery. So Hadijatu became a 5th wife when she was 13 to this 64-year-old man, and she, again interestingly, was one of 7 other 5th wives. So he had in total 7 young girls who were being forced to be at his beck and call and at the beck and call of his legal wives. So Niger abolished slavery in 2003, so criminalised slavery in 2003. Hadijatu heard from our partner organisation in Niger, Timidre, that slavery had now become illegal and that masters could be imprisoned or fined for keeping people in slavery. So she went to a local court and got her liberation certificate, left the master and went to look for her family. She found her family, found her brother and met one of her brother's friends who she fell in love with and got married to. The master then went back looking for her and took her to a traditional court, claiming she had committed bigamy by marrying a person she had chosen. The traditional court ruled in the master's favour and threw her brother, who had consented to the marriage, and her husband into prison. So when we heard this, we just thought that the government of Niger has been going on with such impunity with regards to slavery that something needs to be done. So we worked with Hadijatu and were able to take her case to the ECOWAS Court of Justice in West Africa, where the government of Niger was found guilty for its failure to implement its international obligations, so all the anti-slavery laws at the UN and the ILO, which has signed up to, as well as the regional African rules it has signed up to, as well as its own 2003 domestic law. And so she received compensation for about £12,000 for being arbitrarily imprisoned, and she went on to win International Women of Courage Award and also was named one of Time's magazine's most influential people of 2009. And that's just a quote from her. And what's always interesting to me is speaking to people in slavery, especially around child domestic workers, is their focus on education and children in horrible situations who say, despite how I'm being treated, if only they allowed me to go to school, it would make all of this horrible treatment worthwhile. And it's just Hadijatu also raising the education element, that she wants to be able to send her children to school because she was denied education whilst in slavery. So we work with communities in Niger and we provide education and microcredit for the women, as well as helping them to build wells and have access to microcredit schemes also. It's been a really difficult project, really difficult project in terms of money, and the money is completely insufficient to support what we're trying to do, but we've just recently got another 5 years of funding from Comic Relief to continue the project, so which is a good thing. There was supposed to be a video there, it's not working, so I think I'm going to stop there because we've been for an hour and 5 minutes now, or maybe an hour and 10 minutes because that's late. So yeah, so if you have any questions, want to clarify anything, have a bit more of a discussion?
I think you raised lots of really interesting points, and obviously organisations like anti-slavery are doing some really valuable work, but I think you mentioned it, there seems to be a lack of political will, and I don't know if that's sort of even more of a lack since the financial crisis, and the government's kind of saying, oh, we only have money to do X, Y, and Z, but not all these peripheral issues, and maybe even the UK government thinking that we have sufficient safeguards in our own country. How is that ever going to change? How can people persuade governments that they need to do more, that this is a real and present issue, even in countries that seem to be developed and sort of...
I think you've answered it in your question. You really have. It's like, how can people persuade governments? You know, there are 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 of you here who've given up your time this afternoon, and you know, I'm very grateful for that, and hopefully 9 of you who are committed to taking action. What's your student population here? 15,000. About 15,000. I would hazard a guess that maybe about 400 of that population knows about some of these issues, and I would say you're a representative of the people that might undertake action. And I think that's where the issue lies, is one, not enough people know about it, and two, not enough people maybe care or too preoccupied with other things. There's an event with at Cooper a few weeks ago, the One Billion Rising event, and she sat there and she said, basically, people need to write to their MPs, and it's not necessarily time consuming, but you need to just let them know that they need to take action on these issues, because when we're being constantly bombarded with things in the media about people, you know, wanting immigrants out, the fact that not enough people in the UK speak English, all of these things, that's what we're being bombarded with, and that's what other people are picking up on as well. And so I'm not sure if it's a disservice to organisations like anti-slavery that we're not reaching enough people, or that we're not getting enough people to take action. But if there's a critical mass of people taking action, and without wanting to sound way too optimistic and idealistic, I think we have the power and the means to make slavery come to an end. Going back to transatlantic slave trade, something which was legal for 400 years, within 20 years of the anti-slavery campaign starting, the slave trade and slavery came to an end, and that's without all of the technological advances in terms of communication that we've got today. So the political will isn't there. It really isn't there for most countries, because that critical mass isn't there. And that critical mass isn't there because not enough people know about it, because we're being bombarded with too many things. But Nepal and Brazil, you know, Brazil being one of the BRIC countries, one of the developing countries, and Nepal being one of the sort of middle-income developing countries, and Nepal being lower-income developing countries, implementing these schemes. Brazil has task forces. Brazil has linked it to its anti-poverty, anti-discrimination agenda. It's made an investment into training people, into having the resources to identify and release people from slavery. If those countries can do it because that political will is there, there's no reason why a country like the UK or the US shouldn't be able to take these issues on board and do something about it. But again, I might be kind of saying too much, but you know, when things are becoming conflated, and again, going back to what you mentioned at the start in terms of anti-trafficking and sexual exploitation, you have a large number of organisations that are now doing anti-trafficking work, focusing on sexual exploitation. You have funding for that work, but for the main part, you know, whereas we stand in solidarity with organisations who are doing good work, for the main part, a lot of these organisations are saying to the government, oh, you need to stop trafficking. It's not really going into detail of how they should do it. And so, because issues are being conflated and co-opted by different groups, and there isn't really one that critical mass or that real sort of joined up efforts in all different organisations to tackle the whole issue. I think it just makes it really problematic in terms of coming to a solution. But if one of you told one other person who told one other person who then got one other person to take action, we could get somewhere. And also, not just in terms of the political will in governments, GAP in 2010, I think it was, invested a load of money to change its logo. I think the figures are around 20 million investment it made, and they would never have done that well in The Apprentice because they created this new logo without doing any sort of focus group surveys. When they posted the new logo on Facebook, about 2,000 people went onto Facebook to say, we don't like this new logo. I don't think I've got that list on memory stick, but there's a press release from GAP that says, we have listened to our customers, we always listen to our customers, so we're putting the old logo back, despite the investment that they had made in creating this new logo. I think that just goes to show, 2,000 people can log into their Facebook account and say to a company, we don't like a logo, and the company says, we listen to our customers, because essentially they have to. That's where the profits are made, that's where the bottom line come from. Then they're listening to people when people are standing up for something. Companies like Gap, Nike, etc. in the 90s who were really being implicated in the sweatshop factory work, they have not got it all quite right, and there's still instances of them being implicated in sweatshop labour, but the clean-up that they had from the public pressure that came from that, I think is just testament to show that if you have a critical mass for something, then decision makers will change their practices, but that's what we need to have, and any way that you guys can help that as well would be really useful.
Do you believe that because in these countries there's obviously a demand for certain areas, like for cotton picking, for example, it might be like quite a big source of the economy. Don't you believe that if there's lesser demand for these sort of products from these countries, or even for the sex trade, if there's a lesser demand for prostitution, do you believe that if you were to tackle that side of it, that human trafficking and slavery would go down quite a lot?
So if there's less of a demand for prostitution, for example.
Yeah, but I know it's quite a broad example, but child labour as well. For there's certain things that they're forced into, like fishing villages, for example. If there's a less demand for that sort of product, for example, if it was for fair trade stuff, if there was more of like a less demand for kids working like that, or people being forced into that because that's the only option. Do you think that will tackle?
No, absolutely, and I think it's not necessarily a demand issue in a way. I think it's sort of regulation and implementing laws that are in place. So, for example, a lot of the child domestic workers that we worked with who actually went to the ILO to speak to decision makers about the new convention, they said, we have to work. We are 14, 15, 16. We don't see any other alternative in terms of the economy of the country, in terms of the jobs available. We have to work as domestic workers. What we need are protections and our rights to be respected whilst working as domestic workers. And so I think, one, that's sort of testament to where people are coming from. But when you're talking about things like fishing villages in Ghana, for example, if the kids were in school, they wouldn't be working, and again, that's where it comes down to, I suppose, the government's will to implement access to education and the international community to support and hold the government to account in implementing things like access to education, because there are enough adults out of work in those countries to do fishing, there are enough adults to do cocoa farming in those places, but it's because of poverty in many situations where parents will feel that they have no choice but for their children to go to work. So addressing the issue of poverty, but then also addressing the fact of the people who are most vulnerable to being in situations of slavery because of poverty. And so it is, you know, not necessarily demand, because there will be demand for goods, there will always be demand for, you know, cocoa, sugar, but it's having protections in place and sort of simultaneously tackling things like provision of education for children and things like microcredit for mothers as well, and you know, there are lots of things that need to go sort of hand in hand in terms of development to tackle the issue of slavery. But with the example of remittances being sent back home to families and helping development, it's making sure that things are in place, that provisions are in place, that legislation is in place to facilitate women working and, you know, keeping hold of their money and being able to send their kids to school. It's a Niger school project, for example, whereby the mothers having been granted microcredit, they are then able to invest a percentage of whatever profit they make back into the schools and keeping that going. So I think it's having sort of lots of multi-pronged approaches to tackling the issue rather than just say, you know, let's lessen the demand for cocoa, you know, let's increase, I think, you know, increasing things like demand for fair trade and us demanding that ethical issues are in consideration for companies. You know, fair trade is a great scheme, but it's been found that in some of the farms, the fair trade farms, there's been forced labour of children, for example. So it's having the sort of more ethical approach to business rather than a fair trade approach, the ethical approaches which really look at human rights and children's rights within business rather than just, important as it is, you know, just the sort of system of fair trade in terms of trying to give more of a premium to farmers, which doesn't always get to them as well, but that's an entirely different talk and something. But yeah, so addressing issues which can include demand, but not saying we're going to get rid of demand because it's always going to be there, but making sure protections are in place for when those markets are working.
The international community is able, like it doesn't, do you believe that it has the capacity to help in these countries? Like if you've got people from Western backgrounds who want to help, but do you believe that they have the capacity because they don't understand the culture? There's such a cultural difference that what they believe will be good. Do you believe that actually hampers the effort that you put in?
Absolutely, I do. And I think I studied Masters in International Development and came out being really disillusioned with the whole development industry as I see it, because especially of those reasons in terms of, one, the economic development that we're prescribing to other countries isn't what's made Western countries economically developed, but also the fact that local people know their own solutions, and what we need to do is to support them to implement those solutions. And so in terms of, not just sort of designing projects that we think are going to work, so that's why, sort of immediate thing from, you might assume that immediate cause an immediate reaction from anti-slavery would be, let's ban all child labour, for example, because it's terrible on children. We don't take that viewpoint because we work with the communities and we see how in some instances if a child isn't working in one particular industry, they're going to end up working in the sex industry or something else. And so it's working with communities to come up with their own solutions. And with all the money that we invest into aid, for example, which hasn't worked, it's going back and saying, why hasn't it worked? What conversations, what dialogue are we having with the communities in terms of implementing effective development projects to support them? And so I think we can hamper, through good intentions, we can actually make things a lot worse. That, for example, when people call them the boycott of Nestle and cocoa, and the impacts that had on communities. So yes, there was forced labour in some of the cocoa plantations, but not in all of them. But if you're banning, if you're boycotting cocoa from that country, it's going to affect everyone. And so you saw more trafficking of children into different places. And so it is, if someone had, if an organisation who was starting that campaign had gone into the country, carried out real sort of baseline studies and spoken to people and seen what the situation was and seen what solutions they wanted and tried to implement that, then we wouldn't have had the inadvertent consequence of making the situation worse. So, which is why for the main part we don't call for boycotting, whole country boycotting. We're doing the case of Uzbekistan because that's a state-sponsored forced child labour and forced labour, and because none of that money is going to supporting the communities of people, and so that's the one instance in which we've called for a boycott since the 1800s. But generally we don't call for boycotts. Even tomorrow, with the campaign against H&M, we've dialogued with enough companies, and many of them have stopped buying cotton from H&M, but because we've dialogued so much that they haven't taken any action. And even tomorrow we've actually called them ahead and say we're coming to have this demonstration, so I'm not just going to turn up and say to everyone, oh, boycott H&M. We still want to dialogue with you because we think there are ways in which we can support you to really look at your supply chain and look at ways in which other countries have stopped buying cotton from Uzbekistan. But we don't want to just sort of alienate people in that sense. We do dialogue with companies because we think it's through that dialogue that we'll find actual real solutions rather than just us kind of sitting in our silos in the offices thinking these are the solutions. We need dialogue with all the different people who are involved. So that's a really long answer.
Is that all? Well, I think we can show our appreciation from Michaela there. Thank you. Yeah, I hope you learned a lot about human trafficking there, because I certainly did. Stuff that I didn't know about, particularly in terms of slavery and trafficking. In terms of, this is our second to last event. Our last event will be on Thursday, so tomorrow. It will be at 7 p.m. It will be hosted by Amnesty and Oxfam Society. And it will be on human trafficking and chocolate. So the impact that human trafficking has on the stuff we buy. So cotton's a really good example. Then we're going to talk about chocolate there. So if you head on down, that'll be 7 p.m. It will be in the Ken Edwards Lecture Theatre 2. That's the management building, basically. But yeah, thank you for coming down.
No problem. And yeah, if you have any further questions, anything you want clarified, just send me an email. I'm never in the office, by the way, so I may get around to answering it in the next week or so.